Hello everyone, my name is Imesh Pokharel. I'm the Deputy Representative of the UN Human Rights Office in Seoul. We are here to discuss about the Common Country Assessment and the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. I'll share my experience, what it is, the process involved, and the practicalities involved in the development and implementation of the Common Country Assessment and the Cooperation Framework. The UN Human Rights Body is a UN body and it is a part of the UN country team. Just like any other UN agencies, our office also plays an important role in the development of the UN Common Country Assessment and the Cooperation Framework. The development of the CCA and Cooperation Framework at the country level is coordinated by the UN Resident Coordinator. The UN country team also gets support from regional teams and headquarters. I've experienced working in several countries with the UN Human Rights Office, so have experience working on the Common Country Analysis and the Cooperation Framework. First, let me explain you about the Common Country Assessment and UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. The UN Common Country Assessment is the UN system's independent and collective assessment of the country's situation and analysis of some of the causes and their implications. It examines progress, gaps, opportunities, and difficulties to achieve the 2030 SDGs agenda and also to promote and implement UN norms and standards, including human rights commitments. The UNCCA is not a one-off event. It is a process to track developments and inform the UN system's work on a continuous basis. The UNCCA is updated periodically. The CCA offers opportunity to engage with relevant stakeholders through continuous and inclusive dialogues on several issues such as inclusion, human rights, gender equality. There are also a number of multi-stakeholder dialogues which are organized during the process. CCA uses data, statistics, analysis, and research both from within and outside of the UN system for assessment of the situation. Sometimes targeted surveys and assessments are conducted too. It also builds on voluntary national reviews. A repository for data and analysis established. The CCA documents includes what data has been used. The CCA analyzes key demographics which are left behind and what are the drivers for their exclusion. From human rights perspectives, recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review, treaty bodies, and other human rights mechanisms provide an important basis for understanding gaps and opportunities for implementing human rights obligations. The CCA also has a risk analysis framework covering development, humanitarian, peace building, and human rights issues. It also looks into linkages between prevention, rights, development, and humanitarian. It also looks into regional, sub-regional, and cross-border dynamics. Also, what financial landscape exists in the country for development financing and implementing SDGs. The Cooperation Framework. I'll now explain you about the Cooperation Framework. The Cooperation Framework is an important instrument for planning and implementing of the UN development activities at the country level in support of the 2030 Agenda and national development priorities. The Cooperation Framework is based on the outcome of the CCA. In the past, the Cooperation Framework was called UN Development Assistance Framework. It was viewed as a means of providing assistance to the development activities of member states. Now the Cooperation Framework is more about partnership with government in implementing national development priorities. The cooperation framework is agreed and implemented in cooperation with relevant government. It is a joint UN commitment and a coordinated UN response at the national level. The cooperation framework is a nationally owned process and is anchored in national development priorities, the 2030 Agenda, and principles of the UN Charter. It is an integrated programming process amongst UN agencies. It's a more transparent process and has better accountability. Human rights-based approach to programming, gender equality, and leaving no one behind are the key principles of the cooperation framework. So human rights and addressing inequalities and leaving no one behind is more rooted in the framework. It also is about theory of change, which is an important component of the framework. It's about how the planning can bring changes, what are the desired outcomes and risks, and what bottlenecks needs to be addressed to bring these changes. It has an implementation plan, including joint work plans, as well as evaluation and monitoring framework. I'll now explain the process, what happens exactly. For the CCA, it starts with the capacity development for the UN country team to engage effectively in the new cooperation framework process. This involves training on human rights-based approach to programming and gender mainstreaming. There is also an evaluation of country program instruments of UN entities, as well as preparation of thematic backgrounds and research papers, which feeds into the CCA process. Evaluation of the prior development framework needs to be done, and then the actual drafting of the CCA report, including analysis from the regional level, is then completed. After the completion of the CCA report, the cooperation framework starts with support to national development planning process, including national situation and analysis, SDGs prioritization and nationalization in the national development plans. The cooperation framework design consultations are launched. The cooperation framework outcomes and outputs are agreed with the government, and the document is drafted. The UNDP configuration exercises are conducted. Draft cooperation framework documented is validated with national government and partners. And the final UN cooperation framework is signed by the government and the UN country team, and it's officially launched. After the launching of the cooperation framework, then the implementation and monitoring framework are developed. So it begins with cooperation framework, particularly looking into monitoring and evaluation plan. Funding framework is prepared. Resource mobilization strategy is developed. UN entity, country development programs, which are basically the individual UN agencies' country programs, are developed and approved. Joint national UN steering committees established, and cooperation framework results groups, monitoring and evaluation framework are also established. And then in some cases, joint work plans are completed and approved by the UN country team. And there is a regular monitoring of the implementations of the joint work plans and the strategic framework. The UN Resident Coordinator's Office coordinates the development of the CCA and cooperation framework. Many UN agencies' country programs are based on the cooperation framework, so it is an important document for many UN agencies as their programs are based on this document. It is a major undertaking, and given its importance, my experience is that UN agencies cooperate very well together in this process. As with other processes, there could be differences in identifying priorities, analyzing risks, proposing solutions to a particular issue, But despite the differences, there will always be an agreement. UN agencies are used to joint programming and implementation, so this is not a new process to them. The resident coordinators are normally experienced in leading this process. There is also strong support from the regional offices and headquarters. The mandate of each of the agencies guides the priority. For example, for our Human Rights Office, SDG 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institution is a priority. For World Food Program, SDG 2, Zero Hunger is a priority. For ILO, International Labour Organization, SDGs 8, Decent Work is a priority. However, there are several overlapping areas of work like migration, children and women, rights of persons with disabilities, and climate actions where multiple agencies have an interest. Agencies take lead on their core area of work, but they also support other areas which are of their interest. As human rights mainstreaming is a cross-cutting issue, OHCHR tries to see if the document adequately addresses human rights concerns in the country. A cooperation framework is a negotiated document with the government, so it's also true that not everything that we want can be included. Regarding that questions, I would not speak for other agencies, but for our office, we expect that the new cooperation framework in the DPRK is grounded on human rights principles. Several human rights mechanisms, including the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, have made several recommendations which needs to be implemented. The UPR recommendations that the DPRK has agreed on could be a starting point for developing concrete programs to implement the DPRK human rights commitments. We expect the DPRK to agree to engage more with international human rights mechanisms, including treaty reporting and allowing thematic UN experts to visit the country. Openings for capacity building and technical cooperation projects on human rights will also be useful in strengthening the DPRK human rights capacity. Regarding the strategic framework for the DPRK, the current strategic framework, which was for until 2021, has been extended until next year, which is 2023. The UN agencies has been out of the country due to COVID-19 border restrictions since 2020. It is still unclear when the UN agencies will be able to return to the DPRK. The process for the development of the new CCA and strategic framework should start soon, given the current extended framework expires next year. The CCA can be developed, however, it would not be optimal. There is a need for data, research, and survey to inform the analysis, which needs people on the ground. The cooperation framework needs to be developed in consultations with the DPRK government. For that to happen, UN agencies should be able to return to the country. So I don't have an exact timeline for when the new process will start, but given the current circumstances, it is essential that the UN agencies are able to return to the country to start the development of the new strategic framework and the CCA. Thank you very much. Kamsahamnida.
Hi, my name is Simeunovic Isidora. I come from Serbia, and I'm currently studying international development and cooperation here in South Korea. I was having questions regarding what are some first steps needed in order to ensure that we can implement this successfully and transparently and moreover sustainably in regards to monitoring and evaluation processes in the DPRK.
All right, so regarding your questions on monitoring and evaluations, DPRK is one of the country where data is very hard to get, and independent data. Again, the government does provide data on different themes, and UN and other agencies has been doing surveys, not extensively, but to a limited lab scale still. They've been doing surveys where some data is available. Data was one of the big pillars in the current one, not last actually, it has been extended until next year, of the UN Strategic Partnership Framework, in the UN Strategic Partnership Framework. So we realize that that's a big area which needs to be better explored, and there is a need for pretty good data and surveys. But again, with access and now with most of the UN agencies out of the country, as I said before, that is still not feasible unless the UN agencies are able to go back to the country. So this is one of the countries where we definitely, everyone, including the UN, is struggling with independent data. So how do you do it in such circumstances to have a I think one of the things that, which I explained in the process, is also having a pretty much a genuine and informed assessment of the situations, and availability of the information is I think a good way to start, which could help in a monitoring process at the when we are implementing the strategic framework. So it not only helps to develop a framework that is more targeted towards people, but it also helps to do a proper monitoring and evaluation. So the common country assessment process that will begin hopefully next year, because it has to be negotiated by next year if the assessment and the framework is to be developed starting in 2024. So the CCA needs to be more grounded on the current realities, including realities regarding the lack of data, and some of the programs, as like in the previous CCA, needs to be focusing on developing data, which will not only help us to develop the good framework, but also to monitor and evaluate things of what is happening on the ground, as well as the success of the implementation of the SDCs.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your presentation. My name is Milena. I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in human rights and humanitarian action in France, and I wanted to ask 2 questions if possible. I was first wondering how cooperation with the DPRK government is envisioned in light of international sanctions, and is it merely limited to humanitarian aid, or is there a way to go beyond that? And my second question has to do with SDG 16, because it appears to me that certain SDGs that are more development-oriented or socioeconomic rights-oriented appear more palatable to the PRK government. So how does the UN approach SDG 16, which is more oriented towards civil and political rights?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Regarding your first questions on sanctions and whether development activities are even feasible in the DPRK. In the current sanctions regime, it has both unilateral sanctions as well as UN sanctions in the DPRK against, particularly for its weapons development programs and nuclear programs. The UN country team is primarily focused only on humanitarian support, which is basically, again, although it has a UN strategic development framework, but it's primarily a humanitarian support. Although there are some of the activities which are more long-term and have, which we say, interlinkages between humanitarian and development. But the primary activities that are being undertaken are humanitarian support. Maybe not on a short-run programs, but maybe medium and long-term humanitarian programs. The current sanctions regimes, as I understand, doesn't allow for long-term development-related activities. But I don't know whether you are familiar with the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, and others have pointed out that because if you see in the sanctions regime, particularly the UN sanctions regime, there is a waiver for which we say humanitarian exemptions, right? So are allowed, but the UN Special Rapporteur has been mentioning that activities targeted towards the economic, social, and cultural rights needs to be re-evaluated and be allowed, because if the activities are targeted towards advancement of the economic, social, and cultural rights, and if it is reaching out to the people, then that should be carefully evaluated and allowed. So that dynamic still remains, right? But some of the activities that are planned in the strategic framework, like water and sanitations, we could, of course, it's also long-term developmental activities, maybe even food and as well as health support can be termed as developmental activities, but officially there are not many development activities. It's mostly humanitarian support. And DPRK doesn't want to be, that's what my understanding is, it doesn't want to be just part of the humanitarian basket, and they might be wanting to have more development related activities. But again, that's one of the dynamics that UN agencies and member states are discussing, and I'm pretty sure if there are long-term people-oriented programs, I'm pretty sure that could be exempted by the sanctions committee. Yeah. So what was your next question on
SDG 16?
SDG 16. SDG 16 is, yes. If you see the UPR recommendations by the DPRK, they have agreed to a number of recommendations. Of course, we can argue on the implementation of those recommendations. That is another aspects to look into. But if we look into the commitment part, there are a number of activities or the recommendations the DPRK has agreed to, which somehow falls under SDG 16. So they have not, I would say, the DPRK has not completely denied looking into, I wouldn't say implementing, because that might be a bit too much to say, but looking into some of these areas. But again, from SDGs framework, they have not much been interested on implementing the SDG 16. But again, we had a couple of reports last year and the previous year. We were looking into corruptions and ESC rights in the context of how ESCR rights and civil and political rights have interlinked cases in the DPRK, particularly when it comes to freedom of expression and opinion, for detention, illegal detentions, torture and stuff, because so there is no way that the right to food or right to health or other ESC rights can be achieved without overall reforms, both on legal front and as well as policy, as well as institutional reforms are made in civil and political rights areas. So, and also strengthening institutions to look into rule of law, as well as fair trial guarantees and other aspects which are fundamental civil and political rights. yeah, practically we're not where we are, but there are some areas where they have agreed to. Yeah, they have also committed to ICCPR, although they have not reported to it, you know. But again, we will have to continue to try to push DPRK to work on that area and to also to highlight some of the interlinkages between civil and political rights to push SDG 16 agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. My name is Clara, and I'm from Sweden, and I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in East Asian Studies. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe say a word of encouragement to our participants in our upcoming Model UNSF, and how do you think they should approach these issues, especially those who maybe do not have that much prior knowledge in these issues before?
All right, so the Model UN, good luck with everyone who is participating in this event. I'm pretty sure you have learned a lot, and you have known a lot, but also there might be even more confusions you have now after understanding more. My advice would be to, and even it applies to me also, not only to you who are attending the program, but even after having worked practically on these issues for a long time. For all of you, I think walking on the ground, of course, and looking from a very grounded perspectives will help you understand better, because theoretically and on a policy level, things are what should be done, right? It's more about what should be done. On the ground is what can be done and how it can be done. And I think if you just shift your thinking, because policy level is pretty much needed, right? And you have to understand what are the normative frameworks as well as what can be done, what should be done. But if it's also good to look into the practicalities at the ground level. Even on these issues, I think just taking a document from one of the countries and looking at it will provide you a better understanding of what are the key issues there, you know, the reports itself. Yeah, engaging with people as much as you can. I think that's the best part, to understand what the reality, you know, and to think more practically. So I would advise to if you can, work on the ground as much as you can. It helps to implement more theoretical concepts, but also helps to understand. Also, it linkages the realities on the ground to a more theoretical concepts and normative frameworks. So that would be my advice to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.